we're continuing with the book review. Here is the book, The Cancer Resolution by Mark Lintern. It's like lantern with an I instead of an A. It's a very good book. We're just going to be going in order. And just so you know, on this review of the book, I'm putting the page numbers in here. So if people are serious about studying cancer and they want to buy the book, the page numbers will be in here that we're talking about. So, and again, remember, this is a guy who has cancer himself, and his girlfriend just died from her cancer, and he's scared. He doesn't know anything about medicine or cancer, and he's just plowing through the literature trying to figure it out. So he's just open-minded going through it, and it really shows. He says, despite 65 years of research on the mutation theory, there is still no proof for even one set of mutations that is able to convert a normal cell into cancer. So that's a big statement. What he's basically saying here is that the entire field of cancer is based on a false theory. The entire field of cancer, all the medical school books, all the medical school training, all the residency training, all the fellowship training in oncology, in his opinion, it's based on the wrong theory. It's based on the DNA theory, same thing as the somatic mutation theory, the SMT, and the data does not support it. It's not even like it kind of supports it. The data does not support it. And he makes the point. If all of your therapies and treatment and research are based on a theory that's irrelevant, then how are you going to cure anybody? And he says that's why you have not seen a significant improvement in treatment results since 1950s. Okay, he says it's kind of frightening. All right, so Thomas Seyfried, The Origin of Carcinogenesis, quote, the origin of carcinogenesis resides with the mitochondria in the cytoplasm. This is the metabolic theory, and it is not in the nucleus, the DNA theory. How is it possible that so many in the cancer field seem unaware of the evidence supporting this concept? Page 8. The metabolic theory of cancer, often called the MMT, mitochondrial metabolic theory of cancer. All right, that's another way you can refer to it. It comes out of the Warburg, concept back from the 1920s. Okay, the somatic mutation theory or DNA theory should have been sidelined a long time ago. This means that the oncologists are providing treatments that are potentially damaging to the patient and largely ineffective because they're targeting the wrong functions of the cell. And that's a little bit like what Dr. Day had said. It's your immune system that removes all the metastatic cells and gets the cancer out of your body and heals you, but chemo wipes out the immune system. So why do you want to do that? Okay. The SMT DNA theory, okay, we already went through that one. Okay, he says, in over 60 years, no cure has been created for a single type of cancer, and there is still no sign of one on the horizon. Okay, now he's going to talk about another book, that book of Travis Christofferson called Tripping Over the Truth that came out in 2014. That's also one of the all-time great books ever written on cancer, Tripping Over the Truth by Travis Christofferson. He said, comprehensive sequencing of DNA was unable to find even one single mutation responsible for the most important quality of cancer, its ability to spread. And it's that spread, metastatic disease, that causes 90% of cancer deaths. Focusing on DNA theory makes dietary therapy for cancer seem absurd. However, once you understand the metabolic theory of cancer, it makes dietary therapy sound like a very smart thing to add to one's treatment. Lintern continues, chemotherapy drugs created in the 1960s and 70s are still pushed as the primary treatment today, even though the death rates have remained relatively unchanged in over 55 years of their continued use. And that's why a lot of people say all this money spent on cancer research is a joke, because they never discover anything. And when something good comes along, they block it. Okay, the mercury chelator by Boyd Haley, blocked. It's an orphan drug. Nobody will fund it. 3-bromopyruvate, figured out by that lady researcher Coe and that guy from the USA, Peterson, which is like the most promising chemo drug in decades. Blocked. They won't fund it. So what are you going to do? You get the impression that the chemo industry, they don't want you to be cured. Anything that seems potentially a cure in a patient, blocked. When I say blocked, what I mean is it costs millions and millions of dollars to run these big things that you need to get the drug approved for regular clinical practice. So, okay, so what he says here is that the fact that the same old drugs are being used and that there's been no improvement in the death rates from the 1960s, no significant improvement, he says your chances of being cured of metastatic cancer are currently no better than they were in the 1960s. That's not impressive. President Nixon, war on cancer around 1972 or something. and we made close to no progress. What is that? That's what I tried to say, is that you need Christianity or science becomes a joke. It just becomes corporate advertising. And that's why almost nothing. There's been very little scientific progress. I've been a doctor, gosh, over 35 years, and I can tell you there's been hardly any medical progress since I started. There's progress in things like better CAT scan machines, better MRI machines, things that rely on computers and computer programming and electronics. But in terms of like understanding disease so you can get a better outcome with the patient, almost nothing. They'll still tell you they don't know what causes diabetes, hypertension, obesity, coronary artery disease, autoimmune disease. But the reality is all that stuff's been figured out. It just doesn't get into the books. Okay, he continues. This is why 5-year survival rates are used to describe cancer results from chemo rather than mortality figures, which will paint a much more gloomy picture. In spite of all the new so-called promise of drugs created over the last couple of decades, life expectancy has only improved 4.1 weeks on average for metastatic cancer. So 4.1 weeks of so-called increased life. And you know that any study they do is going to be manipulated as much as they can get away with to try to make the chemo look good. So what he's saying here is, despite probably extensive manipulation of the data, the best they can come up with is that the metastatic cancer patient lives an extra 4 weeks because they're treated with chemo. That's like next to nothing. Then you have to subtract from that all the side effects. And I think the reason is there are a few cancers that do seem to respond well to chemo, and it should be used to treat those. But there's a whole bunch where that it doesn't respond well, but they still give it. You know, the kind of attitude in clinical medicine is the patient's already dead. We might as well give it a try. Whereas it might be better to say, look, you know, they're still walking and talking and able to do what they want to do. Why don't you just leave them alone? But it's hard for conventional medicine to leave people alone. Okay, James Watson, the Nobel Prize winner, the co-discoverer of the DNA helix structure with Crick, he said this: chemo doesn't kill cancer cells, and it's not curing cancer, and it's unlikely that they can make it do so in a practical way in the near future. We know that the current approach is not working because on the whole, these drugs have made no dent in the cancer death rates. So what he's basically saying is people are dying at just about the same rate from cancer as they always have. So we're really not accomplishing much. We have a lot of razzle-dazzle that we talk about, but the patients are just dying, okay? So, and here's the big thing. Stem cells are resistant to chemotherapy. That's on page 14. So what typically happens when you give chemo is you'll shrink the size of the tumor because you're wiping out all the helper cells that surround the stem cells. But you typically don't kill the stem cells. They're able to pump the chemo out of themselves. So they just come back with a vengeance, and they actually do develop the ability to grow more rapidly. And they often will wait 2, 3, sometimes 4 years and then just rapidly grow and kill the patient. I've seen that many times. So that's kind of frustrating. You really should be doing more than just chemo. And I think this whole dietary lifestyle stuff's been largely ignored. And we're stuck in an atheistic Darwinism mindset that prevents anybody from having an intelligent conversation. It's good for people to be religious. My mother was real religious. I think that's why she lived, about 12 years rather than only 2 years that she was given as her original prognosis for metastatic cancer. Okay, Albert Szent-Györgyi, he's the guy who discovered vitamin C. He says, discovery consists of seeing what everybody has seen and thinking what nobody else has thought. And that's kind of one of the points I'm making here. This guy who wrote this book, this masterpiece, he is a graphic design guy. He doesn't know anything about cancer. He doesn't even know biology. He was just desperate because he's afraid he's going to die from cancer. And he was sad and pissed off because his girlfriend died from cancer. So he's a desperate man. And he worked his butt off to figure it out. And he tells the truth, so he writes a masterpiece book. Meanwhile, all these people, and there's tons of them, fellowship trained at the fanciest Ivy League places in cancer, PhD, MD, PhD, and they can't come up with anything. Do you notice that? You could give them $1 billion and they can't find anything useful or do anything useful. This poor bastard, for free, because he's scared and he's sad, he wrote the best book ever written on cancer. I'm just telling you, this is a brilliant book, and he did it just because he wanted to know the truth. And again, it's like Schopenhauer. The best books are written by amateurs because they do it for the thing in itself and not for promotions and profits or any of that kind of stuff. They just want to know. All right, so continuing a little bit on the history of cancer. 1924, the metabolic theory of cancer was proposed by Otto Warburg in his laboratory in Germany. He's a biochemist, won the Nobel Prize in 1931. He just exposed cell cultures to hypoxia, and he found that the cells will sometimes revert and turn into cancer. And he figured that the mechanism was injury to the mitochondria, leading the cell to give up on oxidative metabolism and switch over, become more primitive in a sense, like an anaerobic bacteria, and run on glycolysis. And because it runs on glycolysis, and you make 18 times more ATP with oxidative metabolism, oxidative phosphorylation in the mitochondria along the intermitochondrial membrane, that you then have to take up a lot more glucose. Typical cancer cell will take up about 100 times more glucose than a regular cell. Okay, so in 1953, the big achievement was DNA structure discovered by Watson and Crick. And that led to this tremendous increased interest in genetics. And I think it's more than that. I think what it is, too, is, sort of the billionaires that run the world, they want to clone themselves. And because they want to clone themselves, they're pushing this tremendous increased emphasis on DNA and genetics and cloning at the college level, the med school level, the PhD level, because that's what they want that figured out so they can clone themselves. So, because the reality is, if you want to help people get better, metabolism's 1,000 times more important for helping people. Genetic medicine's a joke, okay? Most of the time when people say something's genetic, it's not even genetic. Like somebody say, well, I have a positive family history of atherosclerosis. Yeah, that's because everybody in your family, they're a bunch of fat, meat-eating, processed food smokers, okay? You're all a bunch of dumb shits, okay? That's why you all have coronary artery disease. It's not because of anything genetic, okay? Your ancestors didn't have coronary artery disease. Okay, continuing. In 1994, they figured out the significance of cancer stem cells. The Human Genome Project was completed in 2005, showing humans have about 21,000 genes, despite having 3.3 billion base pairs. A lot of it's regulatory DNA. It's not junk DNA. It's regulatory DNA, a lot of it. Some junk, but not as much as was originally suggested. 2005, the Genome Atlas project was started. By 2013, they had sequenced 6,000 tumors. And guess what? Not a single pattern of mutation was shown that explained cancer. This is a major, major research outcome that contradicts the DNA theory, the somatic mutation theory. So people need to know that. If you're interested in cancer, you have to know that. The DNA theory, the somatic mutation theory, has been refuted by the evidence. That's important. Whereas the metabolic theory, all the evidence supports it. So that's the correct one to go with. And in a sense, that's what Lintern's going to come up with later in this book. He's going to come up with he's going to agree with the metabolic theory, but he's going to modify it. I'll get to that in a bit. I'm kind of going through this book pretty systematically because he did a good job of really summarizing the research. Some cancers have zero mutation. How could mutation be the cause of cancer when you can have cancer with zero mutations? Okay, and it's not just one mutation that causes cancer. When a cell reverts from oxygen metabolism to anaerobic metabolism, that's lots and lots of changes. There's tons of things are changing. Okay, and you can activate with hypoxia-inducible factor, HIF, and a whole sequence of events cascades from there. Okay, by presenting the DNA theory as a fact, the medical establishment is hindering progress as it prevents resources from being used to study other theories and other potential causes of cancer. Almost the entire cancer industry is built around the concept that DNA mutations are responsible for cancer. There is evidence that oxidative mitochondrial metabolism is a critical suppressor of metastasis. Okay, and some of where that comes from is, how does a cell do its business? Okay, the average cell in an adult is a worker. Like, let's say you're a liver cell. You've got a job to do. You have to do what liver cells do. You have to make bile. You have to detoxify things. You have to store glycogen. You have to break down glycogen in the fasting phase to maintain blood glucose levels for the brain. You also have to run the pathway gluconeogenesis to convert amino acids, for example, into glucose. Also convert glycerols from triglycerides into glucose to maintain. That's the most important thing the liver does, is maintain blood glucose level for the brain during fasting. Okay, so that takes tons of ATP energy to do all that work. So work takes a lot more energy than synthesis does. When you want to grow, you have to make a copy of yourself. So you have to do a lot of biosynthesis. You have to replicate and make a copy of all your DNA, a copy of all your proteins, a copy of all your mitochondria, a copy of all your lipid layers to enclose your organelles, for example. Okay, now that doesn't really take that much ATP. That takes a lot of cancer skeletons, the framework for biosynthesis, okay? So that can run on anaerobic glycolysis. And the relevance is that cancer is all about growth. And during embryology, development of the human, the baby, the organism, the child, you're going to run a lot of cells almost in the same way on anaerobic metabolism so they can grow real fast, okay? And stem cells retain the total potentiality to grow. There's partially differentiated stem cells and there's undifferentiated stem cells, okay? Those are pluripotent. But the point is, it's normal for a cell to run on anaerobic glycolysis when it's in a rapid growth phase. It's normal for an immune cell to run on anaerobic metabolism when it goes deep into a wound, which is going to be hypoxic, devascularized, but it has to revert back to normal. So the cells all have this in the DNA. All the cells, for the most part, have the same DNA, except for a cell with no nucleus, like, let's say, a red blood cell. But virtually all cells will have this. Okay, so they've got these genes. It's just a question of whether or not they get reactivated. And it makes sense that they would have them theoretically from the idea of an original response to the universe when it previously had a lack of oxygen, okay? So we're not going to go into all that, but trust me, the metabolic theory is good. It's really good. And it's going to tell you what to do. Okay, continuing on, he says, how come most of us have not heard of 3BP? So 3BP is 3-bromopyruvate on page 29, and that was written about extensively in that book, Tripping Over the Truth, by Travis Christofferson. And it's like, what the hell? It was like the most promising chemo drug I've ever heard of to come along, and instead of being celebrated, it gets bashed and smashed down and blocked, and it's still like an orphan drug. Orphan drug means that no company will take it on, and because nobody takes it on, it can't get funded. Because it can't get funded, it can't get used. Nothing appears to make any sense when DNA is used to explain the disease of cancer. Vegan diets have shown statistically significant protection to reduce overall cancer incidence. The Japanese diet has changed radically between the 1950s and the 1990s, including a 7-fold increase in meat consumption. This coincides with a 5-fold increase in colorectal cancer over the same period. Carrageenan, the food additive, increases inflammation of the gut, increases leaky gut. At least 80% of cancer research studies cannot be reproduced. So that's a big number. I want you to pay attention to that one. You might want to print screen this. That's an extraordinary number. At least 80% of cancer studies cannot be reproduced. That's why I tell you, you have to have Christianity, Christian ethics, or everything goes into the garbage can. Now, people can laugh and mock at that, but I know a lot of science. I've been studying this stuff pretty intensely since I was 18 years old, and I could tell you, this is the truth right here. 80% of, at least, other papers are going to say 89%. So this other paper says 90% of cancer research is bogus, not reproducible. So what you're basically seeing here is the corporations that are funding this research have made it into a farce, a joke, that 90%, let's call it 85% of the cancer research, it's not reproducible, meaning that it's not true. And remember what Ayn Rand had said. If a man makes choices based on information that is incorrect, he becomes his own destroyer. So how are you going to cure a disease if you can't even be honest about what causes it? Then you're not going to know what to avoid. So this is really a disaster. Okay, now here's a guy by the name of Richard Horton. He was an editor of Lancet, big famous medical journal, and he said this in 2015. The case against so-called science, spelled with a $sign for the S, is straightforward. Much of the scientific literature, perhaps half, may simply be untrue. Invalid analyses, flagrant conflicts of interest, together with an obsession with pursuing fashionable trends of dubious importance, science has taken a turn towards darkness. And that's what I'm saying too. If you don't have Christian ethics, everything becomes on money. And even Cicero had said this a long time ago. What can stand up to money? Very few things can. The only thing that can stand up to money is the Christian ethics. I'm going to be judged when I die by Jesus Christus, Jesus Christ, and I want to meet my Maker, able to say, I tried to do my best, okay? What did Christ say? That which you do to least of my brethren, you do unto me. The afterlife's eternal. The temporal life is just brief. So isn't it more important, your ability to handle that judgment? So anyways, what I'm saying is, it's either Christian ethics or it's slavery and lying and brutality and money becoming all powerful and controls everything. There's no other option. Anything else is all just nonsense. Those are the two options. You know, Gottfried Leibniz, the German philosopher, he said it pretty well. He said there's either God or nothingness. You either have God and you have all these Christian ethics and we're going to treat the individual correctly, because it all comes down to individual rights. As Ayn Rand had said, if you respect individual rights, all the other rights will follow from that. And if you don't respect individual rights, you're going to end up with slavery. All right, so anyways, the last one is another paper. 89%, this is from page 33 right here, 89% of the studies that form the background of mainstream cancer understanding, the fundamental papers, are incorrect. They're not reproducible, indicating that the DNA theory of cancer is wrong. Okay, that's a big statement. An entire multi-billion field, billions and billions, is all based on incorrect information. Okay, well that's it for today. Hope you found that helpful.